Well, good morning, and welcome to today's Lord Mayor's lecture, part of the Knowledge Miles series, which will run during the year when Professor Michael Marnelli is the 695th Lord Mayor of London. Today we're talking about computational medicine and digital twins, improving medical care, and I'm delighted that we have with us Professor Alejandro Frangi, Bicentennial Turing Chair in Computational Medicine and Director of the Cristobal Pankhurst Institute at University of Manchester, as our lecturer today. As you know, I'm Mike Wardle. I'm the CEO here at the ZN Group, and we're supporting this series of lectures, run through the Lord Mayor's good graces. Very happy to be here, and my role today is really to get out of your way pretty quickly after some housekeeping, and then to chair the Q&A towards the end of the session. The program today is quite simple. As I say, my introduction, our presentation from Professor Frangi, and then a Q&A session. The way to put a question in, if you haven't used this system before, is to find the question tab on the dashboard, type in your question or your comment, and you can do that at any point during the webinar. So please do, if you have thoughts and they strike you, please do put them into the Q&A tab, and we'll make sure that we get through as many questions as we can. To say this today, the session is being recorded, so if you miss anything, you want to go back and refresh your memory, or that you have colleagues and friends who you think might be interested in the presentation, then the video will be posted in a couple of days' time on our website, and you'll be able to share that or to revisit the presentation. I think that's all by way of housekeeping. It's a real pleasure to welcome Professor Frangi to the floor today, and the interlink between sort of engineering, science, and finance and economics and well-being is one that I think we're trying to foster through this series of lectures, and delighted that we're able to bring all of those together today. Professor Frangi, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Mike. And so thanks a lot. It's an honor and a privilege to be able to speak today here from the north, from Manchester. So I'm going to talk today about a few concepts that I will first try to define, and that I think that they represent a fundamental paradigm shift. And I will then try to instantiate them in the context of regulatory science in particular, and then try to give a case studies and then some conclusion. So in this era, we are overwhelmed by data, but actually what ultimately is important in many contexts is really be able to take decisions. And those decisions need to be guided by wisdom, that is validated knowledge, which is based in itself upon information and data. So there is a need for data processing and information modeling to generate that wisdom. The questions that we are talking here about are questions that can be presented to clinicians in the normal care of a patient, like, is Mrs. Smith likely to be at risk of suffering from a particular disease X? Or in the case of the right, is relevant to engineers that are actually developing the next generation of medical devices or medical technology, where they're trying to understand is why a particular treatment has poor outcomes for patients like Mr. Smith, for instance. We're going to focus today mostly on the second part, although some of the concepts that I'm going to talk can be instantiated as well in the first type of questions. So what is computational medicine? Computational medicine is essentially the synergy between computer modeling and healthcare. And what we want to do is actually be able to crunch numbers and do predictions so that we can personalize the best treatment options, very much like the way we choose the optimal path in GPS, this in the case of our health journey. And I put down a bit of a more technical definition of computational medicine. Sometimes we also talk in silico medicine. The in silico is because computers are mostly made of silicium, and is as a counterpart to in vivo, in vitro, or other type of similar Latin phrases. But it's fundamentally applying engineering, math, and computational science methods to improve our understanding of treatment of human diseases, as Professor Ray Winslow, who used to be in Johns Hopkins University, used to say. So what is the fundamental problem behind modeling? The course, as I put it here. And this doesn't matter whether it is related to what we call mechanistic models, so those that are starting from principles of disease and then try to instantiate in decisions on individuals, or they are data-driven models. In the current era of AI, data-driven models are very commonplace. The main problem that we have with any type of modeling is that we need to be aware that over the coming years, the processing power, as we know, grows exponentially according to the Moore's law, and this doubling approximately every 18 months. However, the volume of data that we are collecting, some predictions make that is doubling at the moment, is estimated to double every 12 months, but there are some predictions that say that in the not too distant future, they may double every 12 hours. So two exponentials, one which is faster than the other one, means that there is a crossover point, which means at a given point, we will have more data than we will ever be able to compute or analyze. But what is even more complex or more challenging here is that the systemic complexities of the diseases that we are trying to understand and the interactions between diseases themselves is usually modeled as a factorial complexity factor, which is much faster than an exponential and indicates that there is a point where the complexity of the systems we are trying to understand are way bigger than the data we will be able to collect or the processing power that we have to interpret that data. The only way, as I understand, to break that course is to incorporate prior information and prior knowledge. And this is usually coming from basic science and from mechanistic understanding of disease. What are digital twins? Digital twins are like a copy of ourselves in a computer that allows us, is essentially a model, is an abstraction, a digital abstraction that allows us to be to build in knowledge into that model, but also to do interrogation of that model against specific scenarios. And the more alike a particular individual we can make that twin, the more that it has its characteristics, the more that the answers that we will get are probably reflecting potential course of actions or likely scenarios for that individual. How do we build these digital twins in medicine? These digital twins, these digital representations can be of individuals, but can also be from populations. And sometimes we talk about virtual populations, and this will be important when we talk later about in silico trials. But fundamentally, a digital twin is a construct, is a model that is usually built based on comprehensive aggregation of data from a patient. Whether this model is reflective of the life course of a patient or not partly depends on how much real-time that connectivity between the model and the real patient data is. It could be a snapshot or it could be connected over time. And it also can be used for personalized treatment planning, monitoring, and predicting the progression of disease. What are in silico trials within this context? Well, in silico trials are the way of using computational methods to understand the evidence of the evidence behind certain devices. And we'll try to explain before why we want to do this in the first place. There's a number of challenges and trends that are coming up that are actually motivating the need for the using of digital twins in this context. The first is the principle of not harming patients as the first principle of medicine. And despite this principle, there are evidence from some investigatory journalists that have been developing the evidence over the years of the mounting case of failures of devices that have gone, or technologies in general, that have gone through regulatory approval process. And in the US alone, this has led to about 83,000 deaths over a period of 10 years and over 1.7 million of serious injuries that are potentially linked to those medical devices. In the UK specifically, relatively recently, the so-called Cumberledge report was an independent report of the performance and the safety behind the devices that are and medicines that our current regulators in the UK perform. And that showed that there were serious limitations for our current process. And this is not just in the UK, there are similar findings in the US. So there is a serious change that is needed in this context. On the other side, if we look at the other driver, which is providing the best care, we need to find ways to accelerate those life-saving treatments to get to patients. So what you see here in this diagram is the curves of growth rates over the last 20 years of pharmaceuticals, of the demands from pharma, from drugs, and from medical devices. To give you a reference, the compound annual growth rate of the automotive industry is about 5%. So this is bigger than those. And if I show you on the other side over the same 20 years, and again, for both pharma and medtech, what is the amount of devices that have been approved by the regulatory agencies? This is data, I think, from FDA, is essentially flat. So we have a growing demand in the market and a regulatory sort of limitation to actually get through the approval. This has practical implications when it comes to the UK, and especially if the regulatory framework is not reassuring enough from innovators, is that they tend to go to test their innovations elsewhere. And this is what is happening according to a recent report of ABHI and CPI that found that at least 1 in 5 of the health tech companies head to the US for their first product launch, which effectively means that we are paying from taxpayers the innovation in the UK. We have the talent, the innovators, but they find it easier to get approval and serve first a market outside the UK than the UK market where they were originated. This is having a massive impact in many sense that we are losing clinical trials coming to the UK, which also means reduction of the income that comes through the NHS through those trials, and therefore the sustainability of our healthcare system. But the important thing is that these technologies and these challenges are not happening just in the clinical trials. We need to look at the whole life cycle of the product in a holistic way and find ways in which we can fail faster and earlier with the technologies, reducing the risk to patients and produce better patient outcomes. Now, what are the sources of regulatory evidence? And regulatory evidence in the end is scientific evidence. So we call them regulatory evidence, but it's regulatory scientific evidence. There are essentially 3 main routes so far that are being used: bench testing, animal experimentation, clinical human trials. What we advocate with in the context of digital twins and computational modeling and simulation is the possibility to develop virtual participants where we can test technologies without all the side effects and the complexities of all of these other approaches. Now, these are all, and we need to always remember, these are all different ways of modeling. Bench testing is a model of performance, of risk. Animal testing is a model of how things will translate to humans. Clinical trials is a subpopulation that we test where we are making the assumption that conclusions will carry over to the general population. And of course, there are limitations as well between models, computational models. So in the end, all of these models are in some sense wrong, but all of them in some sense can be particularly useful in some scenarios. So what is then an in silico test or an in silico trial? Is essentially a computer-based test or trial that is used to generate detailed predictions of highly controlled scenarios and conditions so that we can understand in a computational way early evidence of risk and performance of medical products. And the important thing is that we can also potentially represent a much wider population and much diverse set of conditions under which those medical products are tested than they could be done in a human trial because of practical and cost considerations. So I talked before about the life cycle and of the products and the importance of that. What we do nowadays is we tend to have designs. We do basically what is done in this line, the purple line, the dotted line. And what you see here in the horizontal line is the whole life cycle of the product, and in the vertical line, the amount of problems that we need to fix in a design before we can consider the design to be optimal, right? And what we tend to do today is we tend to start with relatively a small set of tests of prototypes, because it's very expensive to do prototypes and tests. And at that point, if you are a startup or an innovator, you don't have really a lot of cash to do that. And you try to evaluate your company very fast so that you get the investment to go forward. That implies that you have a pressure from the investment as well to go very quickly to preclinical and clinical trials, because that's what valorizes your company. The problem is that all this process forces you to go very quick and to reduce your design space considerably. And by the time you come to go through the regulatory approval and to human trials, you start finding all the problems that you didn't detect early on because you are testing things on a much wider and diverse set of conditions. The problem is that as you go deep into this life cycle pipeline, the cost of fixing every single problem multiplies in a substantial amount by orders of magnitude. So what in silico trials are trying to do is to push the envelope of testing early on in the design space so that we can actually test in a virtual manner much broader set of conditions and regimes, so that we tend to figure out design problems early on. We still need to go eventually to do to do sort of pivotal trials that are confirmatory, but the hope is that we will get to this point with much more robust designs and with less trials for products that we could know early on that will never get anywhere. This is happening in other sectors, in the aerospace, in the automotive, in the energy domain, but for reasons that I still need to understand, they haven't been developed with equal emphasis in healthcare, despite these sectors being similar in many ways. They are highly regulated, they're highly complex systems, there is a lot of uncertainty in the design, they're multi-scale, there's a similar set of problematics. I'm not saying they're identical, I'm not saying the healthcare is easier in any way, but what I'm saying is that there are similar level of challenges that need to be addressed. If for a counterpart, you look at one particular device that I work on, flow diversion devices for brain aneurysms, over 30 years is still essentially a bunch of wires. And we still have 20% complication rate, 3% mortality rate in those devices. And we could develop similar systems for modeling and simulation as we do in these other sectors. So ultimately, what we are advocating is for the reduction, refinement, and sometimes replacement of conventional trials there where it makes sense, and to use more in the future models in computers and virtual patients to reduce the need of bench animal and human testing with their cost, risk, and side effects of waste, animal welfare compromise, and human risk. Ultimately, we are not advocating the removal of any of these three other areas. What we're saying is that in the future, we have a fourth avenue to work with, and that we need to be taking decisions and choose the sources of evidence in a much more holistic way than we're doing today, and only use bench, animal, and human testing where we could do that through other means that are more cost efficient and harm efficient or harm preventing. So to get a bit more concrete, what are in silico trials? Well, fundamentally, there are three main ingredients for the win. One is how you build virtual populations and virtual participants, how you make virtual examinations and interventions, and how you develop virtual readouts and virtual outcomes from those. And I don't have the time to go in detail in all of those, but I'm going to try to give you some flavor through some of the case studies. So I picked a few, only one that I will go with a bit more detail, and then a few others that I will just signpost. But there is a number of documents that I can point you to where there are a substantial number of case studies across different areas of the technology readiness levels and market readiness levels and in different organ systems. So this is a flow diversion device. This is a device which is very, very small, is put in the brain vessels to solve the problem of brain aneurysm. So effectively what they do is they are placed in a particular direction, they redirect the flow, and they reduce the amount of flow that goes within the aneurysm, promoting coagulation. One way to do what it means to do an in silico trial in this context is to create large libraries of anatomical models where we can virtually implant these devices in each of them. And we can then look at the virtual outcome measures, which in this case is the amount of flow that that goes into the aneurysm after you put the stent, divided by the amount of flow that is before that. So it's the flow reduction effect that you have. And you do that averaged over the cardiac cycle, and of course there is average over the section of the inlet to the aneurysm. Now you can test these across a number of anatomies, and you see here two of them, and you see that there is a difference between them. You can also create from wearable sensors physiological regimes of lifestyle, and you can look for the same patient but different exercise and rest conditions, how the outcome changes. And of course, you can put different competing devices and compare the performance of each of those. So you have a very large space of exploration, and for each of those points of combination of parameters, you need to run complex pipelines like the one I'm showing here, where you go through image analysis, extraction of the three-dimensional models, virtual modeling of the devices and placement of the devices, setting physiological regimes, and then predicting physical or physiological variables that then you do readouts for proxies to safety or outcome measures. And I'm just putting here only a sub-list of the papers involved in that pipeline, just to show that there is a huge amount of both science methodologically, but also validation work going on. So I'm showing here one example of one in silico trial that my group did a couple of years ago. And the title says it all. Basically, through this trial, what we demonstrated is that we could, through in silico means, replicate but also expand the insights that conventional trials provided. And we show in particular that we could reproduce to a 5% accuracy the measures of efficacy of the pivotal trial, which I'm showing here in this diagram. So while the models took several years for us to develop, once the models are developed, we can do as many trials as we want from those devices, and they can be run between 1 and 3 months fairly easily. While this trial, each of these 3 trials that was executed, took about 8 years from design to completion, 6 years of recruitment for the whopping number of 108 patients, and between 20 and 40 million pounds that were required for this trial. And this is just one of several. So for this device, all of these studies had to be done. So imagine people that were put at risk, and was it necessary to do as many studies if we could have done it in a computational way? This can be used not only for implants, it can be also developed for imaging systems. And this is a study by FDA called the Victory trial, where colleagues in FDA develop real trials for testing a new type of imaging system for breast imaging, breast cancer imaging. And they compared 2 techniques by comparing the actual measurements on real people versus computational models of the imaging physics, and using AI to replicate the effect of a radiologist. Okay? And what they published and demonstrated is that through in silico techniques, they could get cheaper, faster, better, safer, and more scalable trials. I'm not going to go into the details of the techniques behind those. You have the reference that you can consult later on. But the important thing is that that's the sort of conclusions that are coming over and over from a number of these studies. And an interesting thing is an in silico trial essentially is a computational program. So you can also have, through GitHub type of methods, ways which you can publish the protocol in a much more reproducible way that a publication that describes the clinical protocol will do. Because you can be very specific about the protocol, but there is all kind of circumstances in a human trial that you don't fully control. And finally, to give another example from a slightly different area, I talk about clinical trials, but what I'm showing at the moment is the fact that you also can do in silico testing. So these are preclinical trials. So for instance, in the case of certain type of implants, you want to show that there is no risk to breaking the bone after a number of cycles of gait of walking. So this is normally done in cost machines that accelerate the gait. So if you want to replicate 10 years of walking, you can do it maybe in a year by accelerating by times 10. Maybe you can do it faster, but it takes quite some time and it's quite some expensive. And industry, in this case, Zimmer Biomet, are already demonstrating the equivalence of those physical tests with in silico tests. And you can think about this in terms of also weight reduction and energy reduction and need zero benefits as well. Now, these are just some examples, but there are many, many other examples. And this comes from a list from FDA, where they also demonstrated examples in pharma, in cosmetics, and in other sectors. So you can consult there in more details. And what is happening from all of this is that the community is starting to consolidate a number of good simulation practice. The same way that there are good manufacturing practice or good lab practices, there is an effort to do something similar in the simulation space. So what does the future look like? Well, there is, the question is, are we ready for prime time? Well, I will not go again into a lot of details, but there is a lot of publication out there from regulators, from standardization bodies that are creating the evidence that we are more and more closer to this particular goal. FDA, for instance, no longer requires animal testing for new drugs because they're accepting other non-animal techniques, among those modeling and simulations. There has been industry that has demonstrated the revenues and the cost savings. So they show that for a particular device, they could advance 2 years the launch of the product. They're reducing the number of patients that were involved in the human trial. The cost that was reduced because of the number of patients that were saved, but also the number of patients that they could treat during those 2 years that they advanced the product, which implies additional revenues to them. And there are also communities of practices you can join if you are interested in being connected with this community. In particular, I'm leading the In Silico UK network, but there is also we connect through Avicenne Alliance, which is a European international version of In Silico UK. And we are working together to develop thought leadership documents that provide facts that you might be interested in, like a landscape report with 12 case studies we produce, and there is some economic valuation of the sector that might be of relevance for some of you. We also recently developed a workshop with regulators, and we produce a report that tells some of the aspects and the questions that we need to address from a regulator's perspective to progress this area. And we also, in some of the studies, map the market that is available, and also did some forecasts in terms of new workforce development and growth that might be relevant if you are in sort of policy making as well. And we also map some of the barriers and enablers for developing this. But among the top ones, the importance is to work with regulators in developing more trust and confidence in this technique so that they can embrace and adopt these techniques. So my final slide is, what do we need to do look into the future? Well, first is to realize that medical innovation and regulation process is at an inflection point. The way we do things at the moment is just unsustainable for many reasons. That computational modeling and simulation is an essential ingredient if we understand its position within the regulatory pathway. And that this is not just a technological transformation. I think technically we are quite ahead in many ways, but it's also a cultural transformation. It's building trust and understanding the relative values and the relative drivers of confidence behind the different forms of regulatory scientific evidence. And that while this transformation is already taking place, and there are, as I highlighted, there is a need to catalyze that by bringing together regulators and industry and academia supporting them. And if you're interested to be as part of this movement and this effort, please join us and help us to take it forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that very, very clear sort of overview of where we are and where we've got to in terms of the use of in silico trials. We've got a number of questions coming in, and please, if you have further thoughts or observations and questions, please do put them in through the question tab. But first of all, Hugh Purser talks about, you referred in your remarks to the complications and even deaths from past use of medical devices. And he asks whether virtual modeling has been used to look back to identify what might have gone wrong. Is that another use of the technology?
Yes, that's a very, very good question. And the short answer is yes, that has been done and it continues to be done. We at the moment have access to a randomized controlled trial from the failed device. And we're actually trying to develop a twin version of that study with the objective of trying to understand whether we can replicate some of the failure modes and understand where they come from. Sometimes it's difficult to do these sort of studies because you need to have access to data that, as you can imagine, is quite proprietary and quite sensitive as well. So it requires very, relations of trust between industry and academia to do this properly. But it's fundamental that we in academia support that and that industry, is willing to open up that learnings, because while this may be on the short term something that, may sound a bit, not the thing we do normally, on the long term, I think it can drive much faster developing and better medicines and actually better products, not necessarily lost in them. The other important point in response to that is that modeling and simulation is not just regulation at the very end for the clinical trials. It's a whole life cycle. It's bringing things that we currently do in post-market trials all the way back to the design phase, and at the same time to bring some of the experiences that we have on the field with some of those devices back into the redesign. And you could imagine in the future trials, computational trials that go in parallel to go to market, but where what you almost do is you predict where things may fail early on, so that you know where to start looking more carefully, and as you have any signal of risk, you can sort of reassess again your evidence and know whether you need to stop at that point or what you need to do, right? So I hope that answers.
Thank you very much. David Bogle has got a question. He's referring to the sort of slow uptake of technology. and wondering whether one of the reasons for that is the complexity of modeling human functions. You had a slide about the maturity of organ systems. Some areas, for example, the heart, may be more mature than others. But to what extent have these models been put together to explore whole body or multi-organ synergistic effects?
So whole body in the sense of having a full digital human, that hasn't been done. I wonder to what extent is really, really useful, because we also tend to do, I mean, if you think carefully, we do the same thing with clinical trials. We only measure certain things in a human trial. So what effectively means we don't know about many of the other organs or some effects, because we simply we don't have any sensor about those or any measurement that relates to those. So you're always making some level of simplification and assumptions. And that's the way we as humans tend to understand complex systems. We simplify them. That's why a clinical trial is a model as well. But on the other hand, there has been some efforts to bring effects that may be in more than one organ system, or the same organ system look at different scales of observation. Like, for instance, if it's cardiac, to look at the whole body circulation with simplified models, say 1D models of flow, but then 3D detailed, mechanistic models of the fluid mechanics, electromechanics of the heart, with incorporation of some cellular effects. So you can, in that way, incorporate components that relate to more than one organ system, or interactions between some of the organ systems.
Thank you very much. Shane Dwinian has asked about the relationship between machine learning and the computational techniques you're using, and whether machine learning has been expediting the process of computational medicine. So is the technology in its current form useful? And where next, I guess, for computational analysis?
So that's, again, a very, very good question. So there are at least two ways in which I think let's say the mechanistic and the data-driven models can work together. Okay, so one of them is that mechanistic models are good when you know a lot but you have little data. Data-driven models are good where you have lots of data and not a lot of understanding about how actually the first principles of that organs work. And the reality is that in real world, we never have a lot of data, and we never fully understand. So we are somewhere in between. And machine learning models are good to put together phenomenological components there where the understanding is weak. But at the same time, they're very good in accelerating mechanistic models execution. So for instance, you can build machine learning models that effectively accelerate and provide lower fidelity solutions to full finite element simulations that could be more accurate, but maybe not. You don't need that extra level of accuracy for the question you're in. And that extra level of accuracy comes at an increasing amount of cost, computational cost, storage cost, or data that is required as an input that you may not have. So I think there is a very interesting space there in what is called physics-informed networks. That is a way to build physics into machine learning. But there is also the field of uncertainty quantification in computational modeling, where most of the times the way we build in uncertainty through machine learning techniques as well, and ways to model, essentially the variance and the uncertainty we have.
Thank you very much. And Nikolai Mahangiev has asked a follow-up question to that, really, just asking whether we can use computational modeling to select between different alternatives during the design of medical devices and implants, and what would be the parameters against which you might compare alternative either devices or alternative approaches to the way the devices are used.
I mean, of course, you can. That's the whole point, right? We want to use these techniques. So the minute that you understand that you can mimic an individual, at least to some level of complexity, and the minute that you connect that with large-scale databases that we increasingly have in the UK, from the UK Biobank as a population study, all the way to the secure data environments that are being built at every region of the NHS nowadays. So as probably many of you know, but the NHS has now developed this framework of secure data environments, which is a way to divide the NHS in digital provinces, I tend to call them. And these are regional, normally between 3 and 5 million each of them, where the data of the NHS is located, and there is mechanisms to anonymize and to be compliant with information governance and GDPR rules. So all of a sudden you have massive data assets where you can build those digital populations based on real world evidence. The advantage of the difference between real world data and what we are talking here with virtual populations is that you can scale up those populations, right? So you can go say maybe you have 3 million, but you could create, but for a particular disease and a particular organ, you may have only 10,000 subjects that have all the data you need, but then you may scale that up through data synthesis to another, to 20 million people. Now, the ability for us to test devices in much more thorough manner than we ever been able to do, even with clinical trials, means that we can optimize the design much better. Now, the question was about against what parameters. Well, that's the sky's the limit. You could say, well, I'm going to optimize the parameters that I always optimize in terms of the design of the device itself, but I want to have now a measure of success, which is not tested against 100 subjects, like in the study that I show, but tested across 3 million people. And more importantly, I want to make sure that in those 3 million people, there is also communities that are usually underrepresented that are also well represented in there, so that my evidence becomes a lot more egalitarian in a sense. Because, as you know, there is a massive selection bias in a lot of the trials that we have. And while, yes, we have a gold standard in a randomized control trial, sometimes those trials don't have a lot of communities for which we then are utilizing those devices. So from the point of view of those communities, you don't have any evidence, right? So in that sense, what you're optimizing is for equality, not only in terms of design, in the technical design. You're also optimizing potentially for cost, because once you know how to optimize, you could put in your objective functions metrics that have to do with manufacturability, with net zero. Again, it's all developing the right types of metrics and connecting those metrics with your design parameters and to the exposures that you have through your models, well, the exposures that you can emulate with your models as well.
Thank you very much. We've got time for just 2 or 3 more questions, but I think we just need to cover them quite quickly. Marianthi Riga has asked whether people can offer to have a digital twin made to contribute to science, provide a baseline of themselves for future diagnosis. This is, kind of leaving your body to medical science, but in a digital form. Is that possible?
Well, wouldn't it be great? I mean, I've been thinking that what we can do is we have mechanisms for organ donation, right? They're processing. Why couldn't we donate our digital data? We can even donate it during our lifetime. We don't need to die before we donate. So yes, I think that's a possibility.
Thank you very much. Then Francesca Sterler has, first of all, thanked you for inspiring interest in digital twinning. And noting that in clinical trials, monitoring patients at follow-up is crucial, and the digital twin capability to adapt through time, provide effective parameters may represent a challenge. But what do you think to that question of how do you monitor follow-up when you've been using digital models?
So I think the real constraint to do that, to implement that vision of a real-time digital twin, in fact, in other sectors outside healthcare, a digital twin has a number of conditions to be. One is that there has to be a physical and a virtual. There has to be a real-time link between them. So that's part of the definition of a digital twin. In healthcare, we use that in a sloppy manner. Most of the times, actually, we don't have a real-time link. The constraint for making that real-time link is not really the modeling. Well, there are some issues in terms of how you model really continuous. There's a computational time and there's a lifetime time that need to be synchronized, right? But the real challenge is, do we have the capability for real-time data collection? And the reality is we scarcely have a connectivity for our regular visits to the GP, with our specialist doctors, So it's all about the highway. I always say that this is like trying to develop the, FedEx, but we don't still have tarmac, right? So you may be dreaming about having a 24 hours delivery to the other side of the world, but you need to have some basic infrastructure, which in this case is digital infrastructure. The same way that in the FedEx case, you need highways, you need airplanes. So I think this is why it's so important, in my view, that all the effort that is being done in the NHS and in government to develop digital connectivity in the NHS is supported, but also that we realize that this is a one in a generation investment because of the size of the scale that needs to be done. And we need to be thinking not only in the use cases of yesterday, not only in the use cases of AI even, but in these use cases as part of that, because otherwise we might be constructing the wrong infrastructure. We're maybe putting, consolidated the road, but not putting tarmac in my example.
Thank you very much. The final question from the audience, then I have a final question as well. Mahmoud Ernesh has just asked, first of all, he thanks you very much for your presentation and the take you've given us, and asks, the big question: how far are we from producing a digital twin representing the whole human body? And I know there's a separate question whether that is something we should be aiming for, but if we were to aim for that, how far away are we from that goal?
I think we are at least 25 years away of that. Because in many areas, we don't even fully understand the basic science, I think. It's not that the problem is the modeling. I mean, there is problems in the modeling. I'm not trivializing that. But what I'm saying is you cannot model what you don't understand. Model is an embodiment of your understanding or the amount of data you have. So in some cases, we don't have data. In some cases, we don't have enough understanding. So as long as those things progress, we will be able to build that model. And in as much as those are missing, we are limited to build the digital twin to that scale, I think.
Fully understand. So a final question really from me is that this is obviously a very fast developing area of technology. I'm just wondering, there must be opportunities here for people who might want to be involved, in investment or taking the work forward. What's the best way that people could get involved with you, or what's the ask if you had a crystal ball and you could ask for what you wanted?
So it is true. I think one of the things that is important is to map the whole supply chain, because I've given you the end game, right? But in order to build the infrastructures and in order to build the models, you need computational power, you need measurements, better experiments. So when you look at this, actually it lifts the whole sector. It's not just the final medical device manufacturers, right, or the NHS, it's the whole supply chain. And I think there is an opportunity there for investing in every step of that way. I would be very keen to talk to those people interested in contributing. We have the In Silico UK network, which is a community with 2,000 people that are engaging in multiple ways. We are working towards the development of also a center of excellence in this area that is a distributed capacity across the country in this area. So reach out and we can have a conversation and also suggest ways in which you can contribute to the discovery and thinking process that we are doing at the moment as we speak.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you indeed. We've really got to the end of our time, and it's been no difficulty in filling that time. A really fascinating subject. Just looking forward to future lectures in the series. On Monday, we have a session on harnessing entrepreneurship of the City of London to help build a world-class 21st century economy. And if you are the next Dick Whittington, please do come along to that. On Thursday next week, the future of building foundations in the city, energy generating assets. On Thursday, the 25th of January, beware the techno fixers draped in sickly green. Those of you who are interested in greenwashing and how it's affecting the world will be interested to come to that. So thank you very much for coming along today and for your engagement. And a huge thank you. You can see Professor Frangi, people are voting with emojis. Which is great. But thank you so much for your contribution today. We really will be watching this space to see what progress you can make going forward. But from us, thank you, and we'll see you again in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.